What's going on, guys? It's Lucas from userbet back with another video. NFL Week 11 userbets. Userbets are start-sit fantasy football drafts where you're given two players matched up against each other, and you pick one to join your roster and you play against the other one. And that's for each roster slot. So it's going to be done for quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and it's going to comprise your roster, and the players you don't select are going to make up the roster that you play against. We're going to be going through two different game modes for it, one standard, one superflex. Without further ado, let's get into it. Here's our standard game mode, and for our QB matchup, we have Marcus Mariota versus Dak Prescott, and Dak definitely has the matchup advantage here. The Vikings have given up the fourth most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this year, whereas the Bears have been middle of the pack. Dallas had a really strong showing last week, and they fumbled the game away at the very end. That's because of Rodgers coming out of nowhere and finally playing up to the level that we know he can play at. So I don't take that anything away from Dak's performance. As for the Falcons, they looked abysmal on Thursday night last week against the Panthers. And this is a team I have a very hard time trusting. The one positive about how bad this team is, and specifically how bad this defense is that the offense will be forced to score a lot of points, giving Mariota a favorable game script. But I still think this offense is a little too risky. So I'm going to roll with Dak and an incredible matchup against the Vikings. I think they win this week. So let's roll with Dak for our QB1. Moving down to our RB1, we have Joe Mixon taking on Alvin Kamara. Joe Mixon has a middle of the pack matchup. Meanwhile, Kamara, he has the fourth toughest matchup for running backs this week. I think the Pittsburgh matchup is a little outdated given the defense has been getting healthier throughout the last couple of weeks. They got TJ Watt back last week, which was a huge boost, and we saw the impact he had immediately. So I definitely think that bumps the defense up a couple of notches. But I'm still going to roll with Alvin Kamara here. Andy Dalton is still starting for this team. They're heavily relying on the run. Dalton is dumping off the ball to Kamara, and we've seen Kamara's stat line look incredible every single week for the last 4 or 5 weeks now. He's just getting so much volume, and I expect that to continue. Whereas Mixon, I think he's going to have a tougher time this week. I think Pittsburgh is a little underrated on the defensive front, given that they've been getting healthier. And I think this Bengals offense can be a little finicky at time. They could either give Mixon the ball a ton like they did when he had that 50-point explosion, or Burrow could throw for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns, and Mixon couldn't get anything. So I'm going to roll with the safer option here, even though he does have a tougher matchup. Alvin Kamara for our RB1. Moving down the board for our RB2, we have Najee Harris taking on Cordarrelle Patterson, and Patterson definitely has the matchup advantage here. The Bears have been abysmal, preventing running backs from scoring fantasy points. Patterson's 2 games removed from IR, so he's fully healthy. Patterson had a great first game back from injury, and then last week wasn't that great. It was a short week on the road against a divisional foe who they played a couple weeks prior. So I'm just going to throw that matchup in the garbage. Patterson is the Falcons' best playmaker, and I expect them to continue to scheme him the ball. As for Harris, he hasn't scored more than 14 fantasy points in a game this year. He is arguably the biggest bust in fantasy this year, and I do not have any confidence in him in this matchup. He's even losing touches to the backup. So let's roll with Patterson, the best playmaker on the Falcons, who has a great matchup against the Chicago Bears. Moving down the board to our wide receiver 1, we have Brandon Cooks taking on Terry McLaurin. And these are 2 drastically different matchups. McLaurin is going up against the Texans. The Texans sneakily have a pretty good pass defense. They allow the 3rd lowest points per game to wide receivers. Meanwhile, the Washington Commanders allow the 8th most fantasy points per game. But I'm still going to roll with Scary Terry. Terry and Heineke have a good connection dating back to last year, and we've seen that since he's taken over the starting quarterback role for Carson Wentz. I expect that rapport to continue, and I expect McLaurin to stay hot. Let's roll with McLaurin here. Even though he does have a difficult matchup, I think the connection with Heineke and McLaurin is too good right now to pass up. I don't think Brandon Cooks is an appealing enough option to take him over McLaurin, even though he does have that more difficult matchup. For our wide receiver 2, we have CeeDee Lamb taking on DeAndre Hopkins, and Lamb has a phenomenal matchup. Similar to Prescott, the Vikings are abysmal in defending fantasy points against wide receivers. As for Hopkins, he's got a middle-of-the-road matchup against the 49ers, but we still don't know what's going to happen with Kyler Murray. He's a game-time decision. Colt McCoy played well in his absence last week, and I actually think that can continue, but the matchup is too favorable for the Cowboys in this one to roll the dice with a Colt McCoy against one of the league's best defenses. So let's roll with Lamb here against one of the worst passing defenses in the league. Moving down to our tight end 1, we have George Kittle taking on TJ Hawkinson, and this is an easy one for me. I'm taking George Kittle. The Cardinals have allowed by far the most fantasy points per game to tight ends, so he's a no-brainer for me. Hawkinson has a middle-of-the-road matchup, so I'm going to roll with Kittle here with the best tight end matchup of the week. Moving down the board, our last matchup, our flex roster slot, we have Josh Jacobs taking on Stephon Diggs. Both of these matchups are middle-of-the-road. Denver does have a great defense, great passing defense. Their run defense is middle of the pack. As for Diggs, this one was supposed to be a home game. They think they're going to move it to Detroit, I think, but to a dome stadium. Cleveland is abysmal against the run, but they're actually a little bit better against the pass. So no huge matchup advantage there for Diggs, but I'm still going to roll with him. The Raiders offense is just too unreliable. We see them put up 30 points, and they could go as low as 0 points. We've seen Devontae Adams put up 1 point in a week, and that is just a little too risky for me. So let's roll with Diggs here. And there you have it. That's our standard matchup. You could take a look at it here. This is what the game's going to look like. And let's move on to our super flex matchup. Let's break it down from the top. For our super flex matchup, we've got Lamar Jackson taking on Jalen Hurts, 2 studs at the QB position. The matchups are around even. I think Jalen Hurts has a little bit tougher of a matchup. Colts are good defending the pass, and Carolina actually has been pretty good too. I'm going to roll with Lamar here. I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. They have the worst defense, so they're going to be required to score more points in this one. And the Ravens are coming off a bye, so I expect them to come out flying and be a little bit healthier on the offensive end. I expect the Eagles to rely on the run game more in this one, since the Colts are more susceptible to the run than they are the pass. So I think Lamar is a better option in this one. Let's roll with him for our QB1. Moving down the board for our RB1, we have Ezekiel Elliott taking on Michael Carter. Both of them have difficult matchups this week, but I'm going to roll with Elliott. And this is more of a fade on Michael Carter than it is a pick of Ezekiel Elliott. The Jets have historically done poorly against the Patriots, and I expect Belichick off a bye to come out and give the Jets offense a lot of trouble. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of scoring in this one. I do think the Jets try to establish the run and get him going, but we saw immediately the type of role James Robinson had the second Breece Hall got hurt. They traded for him, so that just speaks what they think of Michael Carter. So I think when the Jets do rely on the run, at best, it's a split backfield, or I think James Robinson could actually take on more of the carries, especially since they're coming off the bye. He's had a little bit more time to learn the playbook. As for Elliott, he is still battling an injury. We're not even sure if he's going to play yet, and he's still competing with touches for Pollard, but I just think the touchdown upside for someone like Elliott is a lot higher than a Michael Carter, where this is going to be a much lower scoring game. I think the Cowboys and Vikings, it's going to be a high scoring game. And with 2 players who I'm indifferent between, I'm just going to roll with the person who I think has a better chance of scoring a touchdown. I don't love it, but let's roll with Zeke here. For our RB2, we have Ramondre Stevenson taking on Dameon Pierce. Both of them have difficult matchups this week, and I'm going to roll with Dameon Pierce here, even though Stevenson has been lighting up the league these last not even couple weeks, these last 4 or 5 weeks. Dameon Pierce is the bell cow in Houston, and there's no one outside of him on Houston. Maybe Brandon Cooks, but he hasn't done much this year, who's a playmaker that they're trying to get the ball to. And although Washington has been playing better, this is just not a team that I see blowing the Texans out or really blowing any team out. They're a team that wins close games, so I think Houston will still be able to run the ball throughout the entire game, so he's not going to have a negative game script. As for Stevenson, I think the Jets play well this week, at least on the defensive side. They just played this team, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, so there's a lot of familiarity. So I expect it to be low scoring and Stevenson to have a tough time getting going. Damian Harris is back from injury, so who knows if he starts chipping into the workload that Stevenson has been getting. So let's roll with Pierce here, the number one option on Houston and a true bell cow. Let's roll with Pierce. Moving down to our wide receivers, we have Brandon Cooks taking on Chris Olave. Both of them have pretty favorable matchups. I'm going to roll with Chris Olave. He's the number one receiving option on this team, and volume is what matters in fantasy. So even though Andy Dalton hasn't been playing that well, he's been dumping the ball off to Kamara a lot, he's still the number one receiving threat on this offense. As for Brandon Cooks, I expect this to be a low-scoring game and for them to run the ball a lot, and it's going to come down to a field goal. I don't expect Cooks to do that much. I still think Mills is one of a bottom 5 quarterback in the league. So there's just not much trust with him here. I don't love it, but let's roll with Olave. Moving down to our second wide receiver choice, we have Amari Cooper taking on DJ Moore, and I don't want anything to do with Amari Cooper in road games. The splits between him at home and on the road has been drastic this year. He averages around 22 points at home versus 5 on the road, and this isn't even just a Cleveland thing. This has been going back to Dallas. Just something with Amari Cooper doesn't play well on the road. As for DJ Moore, he gets a great matchup this week. The Ravens allow the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers per game. Baker Mayfield's back at QB, and however you feel about him, he's definitely an upgrade over a PJ Walker. So I like that boost, and the matchup I think is too great to pass up. And pair that with the splits of Amari Cooper home and away. Moore's an easy choice for me here. Moving on to our tight end one, we've got Freiermuth taking on Dalton Schultz. And I'm going to roll with Schultz here. It's an easy one for me. Since Dak's been back, Schultz been a top 5 tight end in the league. And Freiermuth is still dealing with Kenny Pickett. This Pittsburgh offense is just unreliable to say the least. So let's roll with Schultz here in an easy one against a porous Vikings secondary. Moving down to our flex, we've got Darnell Mooney taking on Michael Gallup, and Mooney has an incredible matchup this week. The Falcons allow the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, so I expect Mooney to have a big game here. Fields has been playing tremendously these last 4 or 5 weeks now, so I think that's a great matchup. As for Gallup, I think there's just a little too many pieces here. He has been getting more targets throughout these last couple of weeks, and now that Dak's been back, but I still think there's too many mouths to feed. As for Mooney, Herbert just went on IR, a good running back. They did trade for Claypool, but Mooney's still the bona fide one here until Claypool learns the playbook and develops the rapport with Fields. So I'm going to roll with Mooney here with the number one matchup of the week for wide receivers. Moving on to our super flex, we have A.J. Brown taking on Christian McCaffrey, and A.J. Brown gets a very difficult matchup this week off of a 1-point performance last week. I expect the Eagles to rely more on their run game here. The Colts allow the least fantasy points per game to wide receivers, so I expect him to have a tough time getting going. As for McCaffrey, he's got a middle-of-the-road matchup against the Cardinals. People are scared that he's splitting carries with Mitchell, which is true. Mitchell got a heavy workload last week, but McCaffrey is still getting the touches that matter. He's getting the receptions. He's getting the work near the goal line. So all those carries that Mitchell is getting, it's usually they're not as valuable as touches that the ones McCaffrey is getting. And at the end of the day, a team doesn't trade for McCaffrey if they're not going to use him. So McCaffrey's still an easy one for me, even if he might not be getting the 27 points he normally gets if he was on Carolina as a true bell cow. So let's roll with McCaffrey here. There you have it. There's our super flex matchup. There you have it, guys. NFL Week 11 user bet start sit fantasy drafts. Let me know down in the comments who you guys would have picked. And if you want to make decisions like these, check us out in the App Store or Google Play Store called userbet. And as always, good luck in your fantasy matchups and best of luck with your wagers. We'll see you next week.